The disciples of Jesus Christ claim to have witnessed the biggest event in the history of mankind. They saw a risen Jesus, who 3 days earlier died by crucifixion and had been buried in a tomb. The disciples' testimony leads to the disciples' trilemma. They were deceivers, they were mistaken, or they were truthful. Who were these disciples? What did they claim to have witnessed? What about the objections from the critics of Christianity? And what do all of these questions mean for you? How can you share this information in your personal evangelism? Wait a minute. You are personally telling people they need to be saved, right? These questions and more will be answered in this video series. The disciples were telling the truth, and this video series will be a defense of the truthfulness of their testimony.
What's going on? I'm Brother Johnny Mack, and this is Impact Evangelism. The YouTube channel that's all about evangelism. This channel declares the gospel of Jesus Christ and encourages Christians to tell others about Jesus. And this is the Disciples Trilemma Part 21. And in this video series, we've been using evidential apologetics to demonstrate that the resurrection of Jesus Christ is an historical event. And we're going to talk about Mary Magdalene in this video. And Mary Magdalene is very important when it comes to demonstrating that Jesus rose from the dead. Here's why she is so important to the resurrection story. You see, she meets what historians call the Criterion of Embarrassment. The Criterion of Embarrassment. We can establish authenticity with an even greater degree of certainty if the examined saying or story is not only different from, but also clearly opposed to the contemporary Jewish or Hellenistic milieu and or the traditional forming forces of the primitive church, so that it caused embarrassment for the early church. This is the Criterion of Embarrassment. It's when someone writes a history or tells a story even, and that story includes something embarrassing about the subject. That fact is usually true because people don't like to be embarrassed. It's just human nature. So when someone is telling a story, in this case in the Gospels, that give an embarrassing tilt on a story, it's more than likely true, because when people make up stories out of thin air, they don't make up stories that embarrass themselves. The fact that Mary Magdalene was the first person to see the resurrected Jesus, her and a group of women, meets this criterion of embarrassment, because in the first century, in Jewish culture and in Roman culture, women were pretty much second-class citizens. And in fact, their testimony was not even allowed in court. Let me read you a quote from the first century historian Josephus. Josephus was a Jewish historian that wrote for the Roman government. And listen to this quote by Josephus. He writes in his work of Antiquities, "From women let no evidence be accepted because of levity and boldness of their sex." So what he's pretty much saying there is that women are so temperamental that you can't trust what they say. So this is coming from a Jewish historian in the first century, which is the same time period that the Gospels were written and when Jesus was living. This shows that in the culture that women's testimony was considered less than what a man would say. And then we have the Greek philosopher Celsus, who was a polemicist against Christianity in the 2nd century. And he writes about 175 AD, and he discredits the resurrection story as a report from hysterical women. So we see in both cultures of the time, the Jewish culture that they lived in the first century, and the Jewish and the Greek culture, that both cultures considered the testimony of women as less than the testimony of men. So, if this gospel narrative was made up, if the resurrection was made up, the gospel writers would not put a woman as the first witness to the resurrection of Christ. And here's why. Because people didn't accept what women said. We just examined that. And so that would have made their message harder to be understood, harder to be accepted by other people. It would put a hindrance to the gospel, but it was the truth. She was the first person, along with a group of women, to see Jesus resurrected from the dead, but this hindered their message. But if they were just making up a story out of thin air that they wanted to spread rapidly, they would not have made Mary Magdalene the first witness. It would have been one of the disciples, one of the 12. It would have been Peter or John or James or one of the other apostles, to make themselves look good, not to embarrass themselves. It's an embarrassment to them that the first person that saw Jesus risen from the dead was a woman. And not only that, again, her testimony wouldn't be readily accepted as a man, but it was the truth. Mary Magdalene was the first person to see Jesus risen from the dead. So this meets what historians call the Criterion of Embarrassment, which shows that Mary Magdalene's testimony is truthful. Now let's talk about Mary a little bit. Let's give some facts that the Gospels give about her. Mary was from the small fishing village of Magdala, located in Galilee on the western side of the Sea of Galilee. She is mentioned 12 times in the Gospels, so she was a very important person. The Gospel writers want us to know about Mary Magdalene. We first see her in Luke chapter 8, verses 1 through 2, where Jesus casts 7 demons from her. Looking at other demon-possessed people in the Scriptures, we can see that Mary Magdalene had a hard time. I mean, these people that were demon-possessed were suffering physically and mentally and emotionally, and this was who Mary Magdalene was when she first met Jesus. We also see that Mary traveled with Jesus and supported his ministry financially. We see this in Luke 8:3. So she was a person of some means. To be able to support Jesus' ministry and follow him around, she had to have a little bit of cash. So she had to be a person of means. We see that the name is listed in the Gospels with other people. It's always listed first. And this shows the primacy. When a group of people is listed in the Gospel, say like the 12 apostles, Peter is always listed first. That's because the Gospel writers wanted to put Peter as the primary apostle of the 12. And when Mary is being listed along with groups of other women, except for one exception, Mary Magdalene is always mentioned first. And also, according to the 4 Gospels, Mary was a witness to the crucifixion of Jesus. She was also a witness of his burial. And Mary, along with a group of women, were the first witnesses of the empty tomb. So according to John chapter 20, verses 11 through 16, she was the first person to witness the risen Christ. She was also, this is very important as well, she was also the first person to be commissioned to tell people about the gospel. In other words, she was the first person that Jesus told to go tell others that he had risen from the dead. So we see Mary Magdalene, who was a witness to the whole gospel story. She was with him during his ministry. She saw all of his miracles. And she was there at the crucifixion. She witnessed Jesus die on the cross. And she also witnessed Jesus being buried in a tomb. and she was the first person to see Jesus risen from the dead, and she was the first person that Jesus said to go tell others that I'm risen from the dead. So Mary Magdalene is a very important person when it comes to the gospel narrative. Here's another important thing you need to know about Mary, that when the Gospels mention a person by name who had been healed, or a person who witnessed something, or a person who was a disciple of Christ, most scholars believe that these people were named because they were part of the Christian community at the time of the writing of the Gospels, and their story could have been verified. So we see plenty of people in the Gospels who were healed, but you don't hear their names. We see other people that are healed, like Bartimaeus, like Mary Magdalene, and scholars believe that the reason why these people are named again is because they're part of the Christian community at the time of the writing of the Gospels, which means their story could have been verified. So Mary Magdalene's witness about knowing Jesus, following him for, close to 3 years, she supported his ministry. She saw him die on the cross. She saw him buried in a tomb. And she was the first witness to see Jesus risen from the dead. So these things are very important. And she was alive when the Gospels were written. So when people reading these Gospels see Mary Magdalene's name mentioned, she was still alive. People could go check out the story and verify whether it was true or false. And she was never discredited. Okay, there were many first, second century people like Celsus and others who tried to polemicize against the Christian religion. There were many critics of the gospel story in the 2nd century. And so Mary Magdalene's story would have been easily checked out and could have been easily proved false because she was still alive when it was written. And by the 2nd century, there was, first, second generation of Christians and other people that this story could have been verified. Eyewitnesses could have been still alive that knew Mary, that could translate her story. And so it was never disqualified. It was never disproven, let's say. So we know that Mary Magdalene's testimony about Jesus was true. And here's another thing you need to know about Mary, that the Bible says that she was a disciple of Jesus. Now, Jesus was a traveling teacher, a traveling rabbi. And Jewish rabbis at the time never took women as disciples. And so what these rabbis would do, they would get a following, a group of people, and they would teach them the Torah, teach them the law. And they would make disciples, and then they would make other disciples. And that's the way it went. And they would follow them around. That was their livelihood, so to speak. They were sort of like on a field trip constantly, like going to college, I guess. But they were constantly following these rabbis around, and they would teach them and go to synagogue with them and all these things. And so they never had women as disciples, but Jesus did. Jesus broke the mold in so many ways. So Jesus had Mary Magdalene as a disciple in the 1st century. And this would also have been embarrassing. There again, that meets the criterion of embarrassment, which shows that this gospel message that was delivered by Mary Magdalene, her witness, her testimony is truthful. So, Mary Magdalene was a huge source for the Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all talk about Mary, and they all get a lot of information from her. She was eyewitness to a lot of these events. And the special thing about Mary to me is that when Jesus told her to go tell others that he had risen from the dead, she obeyed him. She did it. She didn't question it. She didn't, say, why me or whatever. She obeyed Jesus. Jesus has also told you and I to do the same. If you're a Christian, you're a believer in Christ, you believe that Jesus died on the cross and rose again from the dead, and you've received him as your Lord, He has commanded you to go tell others just like he told Mary. Now, will you be obedient like Mary? Will you tell others that Jesus is risen from the dead and that he is Lord? So if you want to make an impact on this world, what are you waiting for? Go out today and share the gospel. And I'll see you next time on